I believe I've organised all my notes for this one. We're on. Welcome, dear listener and fellow archivists. This is your archivist, Jerome, and it is my honour to discuss one of the great powers, and thankfully one of the faithful. We've had a few discussions over in the archive with regards to how we wanted to address them, as certainly the next two could be lengthy, so we're going to keep it in a very overview standpoint, because the two powers we're going to talk about, not both at the same time, but over the next couple of logs, are certainly vast. I'm saving the best to last, of course, but let me discuss with you the Empire of Drvania. The Empire of Drvania is a mighty imperialist front. They are a very authoritarian, very powerful group, but one does not simply behold the might of the imperial army, the vastness of the imperial holdings. One must really look at it all and marvel at just how it stayed together, but also how brutal of a regime it can be, not just to their enemies, but to their own at times. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. Let me first discuss the founding of the Empire, as we know it. Now, this is a very storied part of the Empire's history, and often embellished a bit, but from what we can confirm, the Empire was founded some 200 years ago now, to be precise. And over that 200 years, it has rapidly grown, with the first 80 years of its existence being brutal war and conflict, followed by a brief time of peace, and then further escalation of conflict, up until the current day. You may remember from our log of the Republic that the two have gone to blows 3 times. 2 of those times are under the current Emperor, for there were 3 emperors in the Empire's history. Let's start with the first. The most renowned and divine Lord Drvania I. Lord Drvania, believed by most to be one of the Maker's own disciples, is said to have travelled the world, before the cleansing and then after, having augmentations that have allowed him to live, allegedly even to this day. Bear in mind the cleansing was a long time ago now, so he eventually stumbled across the Mongolian steppe. He noted the people had survived and done well. And so, after unifying them through diplomacy and a little bit of war, he brought them to heel, and then reached out to nearby settlements from the lands that were formerly Russia and China, and other nearby regions. He essentially galvanized them into one unified front, with the promise of prosperity, unity, and protection in the New World Order. The cleansing had long ended now, but the people still needed hope. And hope he brought them, bringing to bear one of the last great city formers, a titanic autonomous unit able to fabricate and literally print buildings. Its final act was the formation of the Empire's great megacity, the Drvanian Heartland, also known as Greater Drvania, is a massive metropolis built by this one city builder. The machine itself long worn out afterwards, and was decommissioned, though there is a statue representing it, its final act. As much as this thing was a machine, it was seen as one of the greatest achievements of the early Empire. To that end, they did try to find others, though none really were around anymore. Such inventions were a lost art from the age of the economic bloc. Now, once the core land had been formed, Lord Drvania would then look to the people. Those who were willing were chosen. Once they had proven themselves, they were brought up into a new formation. The first of its kind, The Iron Tengari. The Iron Tengari were the Empire's primary military force. Elite cyborg infantry, whom had much of their legs almost entirely replaced with mechanical components, their internals augmented to allow the fitting of a powerful reactor, their arms almost completely replaced, and much of their internals in their head and neck modified as well, and their spine completely replaced. This became the backbone, so to speak, of the Empire's conquest. The Iron Tengari modelled off various legends and also implementing a bit of nature. For Lord Drvania had made note of how nature had adapted animals to scale mountains like they were flat, to scale the vertical like it was nothing. He believed his warriors needed this advantage. In the ruination of cities, in the mountains, in areas where tanks simply could not go. And bear in mind, this was after the cleansing, as I stressed before. Much of the world military hardware was decimated. So, he took advantage. While the Empire's industry was spinning up, these cyborgs would be the first. He would send them out, in particular into various territories of China who did not immediately yield, and also, very significantly, into the remnants of the Russian economic bloc. The Russian economic bloc was a powerhouse. It was a veritable industrial powerhouse with a vast military, much of which decimated during the cleansing. And when the horrors went rogue, if it's to be believed. More details on them in a more redacted log, but they are a big reason why much of Russia is not inhabitable anymore. That and the final act of the Russian-Drvanian conflict. As yes, the two clashed viciously. What tanks they did still have didn't matter. The Tengari outmaneuvered and destroyed them, wielding early prototype particle weaponry, but also advanced anti-material weaponry. Their smallest armament, a heavy machine gun firing borderline tungsten rods through any material. These would later be modified to more long-range sniper-type weaponry. Various rocket launchers, recoilless rifles, the works. And also brutal close-quarters melee weaponry. This was before the mass adoption of high-frequency blades. As such, these were more brutalistic weapons. Later swapped out for high-frequency blades. And other weapons. We'll get to that later, though. Point is, the Iron Tengari conquered a lot of Russia before some of the last atomic weapons were deployed. Now, on their own, it certainly would have caused a problem. But the Iron Tengari were also heavily resistant to radiation, as was required in the world. So the radiation would not have been an issue for them. The Empire had technology to scrub radiation. The blast itself, of course, significant problem, had there not been another problem on top of that, in that the very horrors beneath the Russian plateaus awoke due to the atomic blast. Again, see redacted logs for more of what happened there, but that was as far as the Russian conquest went. They didn't dare go forward. And those denizens of the far north also became a problem too. As such, the Russian colonies were retrofitted into fortresses, and are deemed one of the most brutal places to live. The early remnants of the Drvanian military who weren't the Iron Tengari were stationed there. The Tengari instead pushed east and south. And west to quite an extent as well. Now, they didn't go much further than the former coastline of China, as at the time they didn't believe anything had survived past that point. There was no sign of life. This would later be disproven by their descendants, but we'll get to that later. They then swept much of China under their wing. This would become the heartland of the Empire's industry, and also a very big contributor to the cultural shifts that would happen, as a variant of Mandarin became quite the commonplace in the Empire, and in fact has become quite the predominant language of the Empire. Though some of the older Empire heartlands do retain some of the more Mongol roots, and units like the Iron Tungari retain that more traditional name. Supporting the Iron Tungari were the latest addition, and what this industry was used for. The Khan-class skyships, the largest aerial warships the Empire had ever produced and would ever produce, with the largest and most powerful of these being a mighty dreadnought known as the Emperor's Will. This would feature prototype weaponry which would later be deployed on its own, a massive turret with a dragon's head adorning it, with a 8-barrel particle cannon. This would later be deployed as the Emperor's Edict, its own weapon, whereas the Emperor's Judgment was more than sufficient to dispatching anything, frankly, that it came across. Though this particular warship wouldn't leave the Empire heartlands often. It was deemed too valuable. Despite its various laser arrays protecting it as well, this support ship didn't really leave the lands of China much. However, its sister ships did, heading towards the west, and one other big conflict was in the mountains of Afghanistan. The people there, a hardy bunch, able to ward off almost any invader. However, the Iron Tungari were not just any invader. They too were masters of mountain warfare. The tunnels were no match for them. The guerrilla tactics would work on an enemy who would tire. These would not. And when the people finally capitulated, the Empire was impressed. In a rare stroke compared to the modern Empire, who would take a very dim and very brutal view on this defiance, the original Emperor deemed that these people had earned his respect, and as such were deemed worthy to be brought into the Iron Tungari. This would be where a man who would later be known as the Desert Khan, General Tariq, would be born. He deserves his own log, but this man would revolutionize the desert front of the Empire, and would be very important in the founding of the Eastern Auxiliary Corps, and the deployment of a variant of tank that would become very popular in that part of the Empire. As the Empire didn't utilize a lot of tracked vehicles, the terrain in that area was so blasted and mountainous, it just wasn't practical. As such, walker tanks were far more in fashion. These large and imposing vehicles, a newer addition to the Empire, now their industry had really come online, were decently sized mainline battle tanks with bulky legs, with additional shielding inside of them to best protect them, as the legs were the weak spot in many respects, but also their advantage. Able to climb along the sides of terrain over buildings, they could support the Iron Tungari, but were not as quick. Would later also be fitted with various particle cannons as well. So, nothing to scoff at, and you may notice the Empire's love for particle weaponry. This was another specialty of Lord Drvania, and he gifted this secret to the Empire, as well as various laser weaponry. You might say, well, if the Iron Tungari was so important, so terrifying, then why are the Dragoons a thing? Well, dear archivist, or dear listener, that's because, well, think about what the Iron Tungari had to face. The Iron Tungari were not fighting unified peoples, they were not fighting augmented troops, they were fighting the remnants of the old world, who did not have the infrastructure, leadership, and simply put, the hope to fight these monsters. But when they encountered the Republic for the first time, initially they were very successful. But the Republic slaughtered them. The Republic themselves, having some laser weaponry, slaughtered them. Their railguns, that were still in the early prototype stages, were able to match them. And quite frankly, the most significant problem was the terrain. The area around Europe was flat, especially after the cleansing, very flat. And so all they had to do was lure them into the flatlands of the Mediterranean and ambush them. This crushing defeat, and not to mention one of the acts which I did not mention in the Republic's log, but I will mention here, there was a bit of a war in the air. This war in the air was to deal with a oncoming Khan-class warship, which would have won the war on its own almost. Seeing the Tengari struggle so much, they deployed one immediately, even though there were risks. The Republic answered with a strategic strike. A squadron of stealth craft from the old world, fitted with a single atomic payload, low-yield nuclear missile. This one missile hit home. The warship was not taken out by it, but instead crippled, and had to claw its way back. This alone changed the Empire's perspective, and also gave them a bitter taste of defeat. On top of this, the demons began their invasions, so the Tengari were needed elsewhere. After this crushing defeat and a need for change in the Empire, as many of the lands they had taken were simply, well, not integrating well, being brutally conquered as they were, and the Tengari were too few in number and too slow to be replaced. As such, Lord Drvania did the one thing he knew he could do: change his role from Emperor to Caretaker, to deal with some of the problems that required his intelligence, but he needed someone to act as a leader, to allow him to do what he needed to do, to guide the Empire's technological development and spiritual understanding, as the Empire is a worshipper of the Maker. It might not be zealous sometimes, but they do still worship him. Lord Drvania was a strict adherent to the Maker's teachings, after all, so it is said. To that end, a great competition was had, which led to not just a competition of strength, but of will and of mind, which ended with the finding and crowning of the second Emperor, Lord Arius the Reformer. Lord Arius allegedly came from far afield in the European zone, and had fled to the Empire of his family when he was very young. This man was known as the Reformer for a reason, for when he took the throne, gifted with a new cyborg body by the first Emperor, which made him immortal, life support system so effective, and this new centaur-like body he was given, so efficient, he would never die of natural causes, allowing his mind to be at its peak forever. He used this and his own great intelligence to declare his great edicts. There were 3 in total. 3 great reforms to the military, but also as part of those reforms were cultural. The first great reform was the foundation of the Dragoon Corps, something the first Emperor had already planned, but had never been able to have really come to fruition due to the needs of rulership. With a new Emperor, that changed. He was then able to hand the reins, and this Emperor commissioned the Dragoons. The Dragoons were a change of pace. The Iron Tengari were a brutal, decently fast, and very much able to patrol the more dangerous terrain where tanks could not go. But they were not as fast as the Dragoons. The speed required for the new way of warfare was far greater than they could manage. And so the Dragoons were formed, using some of the same technology to be able to climb, but not quite as well, but still very well enough to be able to climb some of the mountains and some buildings, though they lacked the jump and the leap of the Tengari. And also the experience. These Tengari had been in service for, at this point, nearly 100 years. The Dragoons themselves also barely aged, not quite as sufficient life support as the Tengari, but the fact they were more machine than man meant that they wouldn't age as fast. It was a great sacrifice to make them Dragoons, however. Anything from below the torso was removed, leaving only the stomach area and up. Then, Most of the arms were replaced, and internals were augmented, and then fitted to his centaur body, a sort of horse lower half, with various weapon systems built into them, and a much more potent reactor, allowing them to run indefinitely. The Dragoons were then sent to retake areas the demons or horrors had taken, and initially were sent over to the Japanese Isles, as it was discovered the region was still very much around. This was not as successful as they thought it was going to be, as the people there were far more unified than expected, and had made use of their own super heavy flyers, great flying fortresses that were armed to the teeth. It was deemed this was not of good use of the Dragoons. However, this is also when they encountered the Leviathan Brood, a aquatic variant of horror, and the Dragoons did well at fending them off. So well, in fact, that they then began mass production of the Dragoons. From that point on, the Dragoons would become the primary cyborg force of the Empire, the Tengari falling back to the wayside, mostly defending the Imperial Heartland. They would return later, though. The Dragoons themselves were sent far away to all parts of the Empire, but also were sent to scout the various now dead seas and to discover what was there, to act as a vanguard for the army. They were, however, more used as a reactionary force, as the Reformer was hesitant to declare war, which was the second part of his great reforms, a cultural one, not just for the military, but for the people. For the military, it was to move away from purely relying on cyborg troops. There was not enough of them, and there was enough unaugmented people who could fight, who were not suitable for Tengari or Dragoons, but were suitable for more traditional roles. As such, the Imperial Army was formed, mostly filled of conscripts and some voluntary troops. Typically, this would be divided into two. The conscripts, to be the en masse with base weaponry, various mass-produced ballistic weapons, rocket launchers, that kind of thing. Then, supported by more elite regulars, these were voluntary troops who were given a bit more time and attention due to their willingness. These were trained more like shock troops and special forces, given access to earlier prototypes, and often wielding lasers, and in some cases even man-portable particle weaponry. They would often be used to provide specialist support. Supporting these elements would then later be the Walker tanks, and later the Prowler tank would join this role for the auxiliaries, as they were also starting to be commissioned as well. Resources out that part of the Empire were lesser, but the Prowler tank was deemed a success, a almost trapdoor spider-like way of fighting. It would bury itself underground and then ambush. Later, it would be retrofitted with a particle cannon of its own to give it added sting. This ambush predator of a tank would support the far more rugged and ill-equipped auxiliaries. As for the main forces, the Walker tank itself was there to support them, able to traverse where most tanks can't go, and its particle cannons would shred anything got too close. Another element was air support. The various Thunder fighters and Lightning bombers. Simple enough air support roles. But it was deemed that they needed to be returned to the foreground. And the cyborgs themselves would be the shock element, the hammer to the anvil. There was also the development of the Domination class warship, a smaller sister ship to the Khan, far more replaceable, far more efficient, and importantly, not just equipped for ground support, this was able to engage air-to-air engagements, and could transport troops, in particular, things like the Dragoons. Now, of course, you may mention, what about the Third Emperor? And, well, let's just say the Empire's need for war came up. We'll get to him in a second, though, because culturally, the Empire began to change, as the Reformer wanted the Empire to come together and absorb all the cultures they had accumulated and bring them in line, not to override them, but to incorporate them. This unified cultural front would help bring unity to the people, no matter where they were. Now, the final reform to the Empire, and this was an important one, was the allowance of corporate entities to work inside of and be part of the Empire. Both homegrown, but also foreign corporations. Various groups from Neo-Eden, from the Republic, or just corporate states, including those that now ran the Japanese Isles. Now, after these reforms and a lot of work was done, the Empire had become quite a strong force. But there was a hunger. They had tasted defeat, and the Empire wanted to taste victory once more. As such, after a skirmish of Neo-Eden, which led to a decimation of an entire lance of dragoons, bar few who were allowed to escape, this brutal attack, led by and praise be upon his name, a high-order Seraphim class, simply known as Ryza the Tempest. The Tempest was a brutal air-to-air combatant, his frame retrofitted for this purpose, but also fully capable of ground support roles. With a wing of Dominion-class low-order angels and air support cherubim, all of which we will discuss in a later log, decimated the dragoons, even in melee combat. This was deemed unacceptable, and so the final big change to the Empire would be the beginning of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment project was to find a way to produce a construct as strong or stronger than the angels. The Enlightened were the result. The first of which, a man who would later be known the Screaming Storm, Rizal Ragul. Lord Ragul, as he would of course be known, would challenge the Reformer, claiming his weakness and cowardice had damned the Empire, and so using his new enlightened body, challenged and defeated him, and once deemed competent to be Emperor, Lord Drvania augmented him further. It is said that his newest frame is almost the size of a building, allowing his mind to be like a supercomputer, able to see the whole Empire, manage it all while connected digitally. But he pushed the Enlightened to be built, and also then pushed for the Dragoon Sky Corps to be built, as they were easier to construct, and would later commission various specialist roles to the Dragoons, removing their generalist role to be more specific. So some would be the Hammer, using particle lances and heavy armor, some would be bodyguards, some would be specialist tank hunters or air hunters, some would be scouts. He also pushed for a retrofit to the Iron Tungari, recognizing their devotion and power. As such, they were given the same power source as the Enlightened, and various modern armor and augmentations, as well as the mighty Gundaus that the Enlightened wear. These great staves with blades in the end that crackle with lightning. A extremely brutal high-frequency weapon, not to be meddled with lightly. Lastly was his final verdict, that the Republic must burn. As such, he sent an enlightened Khan and dragoons to the Republic, and issued in the Second and later Third Wars. You will recall from the Republic's log how that went for them. Not great. Now, this leads us into the current era of the Empire. They've taken a lot of land beyond their current borders, and have even created new colonies out in the Wasteland Sea, where they can do it, and have even dabbled in trying to get into the Australian outback, to claim many of the natural resources still present there. The sand's red from iron, and red from the blood of those trying to claim it, frankly. You may remember the Stimmers and the Raiders have a strong holding there. The Empire now a very brutalist society. Strong military tradition. The Dragoons seen as the symbol of the Empire. But also, they are an empire that must continuously show their strength, they must show their power, but aren't always able to. They don't have access to shards like the demons have, or the enlightened technology of Neo Eden. They don't have access to paracausality. Their technophurgy in that end, though, is to dampen, to weaken, to take the edge off other technophurgy and technology to try and give them an edge. The Enlightened are strong and are able to even fight angels, but they're not fast. Not as fast as the angels are. And so they must use this technophurgy to dampen and weaken enemy cyborgs and other technologies that are faster than them. The Enlightened, though, do make use of some paracausal technology. And it's the only example of this in the Empire. This paracausal technology does allow them to weather laser fire. You might wonder about the Khan warship. The warship's power source creating a bit of an ambient storm around it makes it very difficult for laser fire to hit due to the conditions around the ship, hence its own shielding from it almost. Now, to avoid going too far in and going too long, as, again, I wish to keep this as an overview, the Empire in its current state are a mostly unified but fracturing people. In the Heartlands, the Empire is a strong metropolis with corporations providing various products and services for the people, all under the Empire's watchful eye. In times of war, conscription is mandatory for all men and women of age and physical sort of capabilities, though only a certain percentage of the population will be selected to ensure that they can, well, recoup the losses. Of course, often the Empire's on the defensive now, raided by all sides, and the edges of the Empire are struggling. Either because they were brutally conquered and made into penal colonies, or because they are continually under attack. Either of these has lended the Empire to be on the defensive now, though in recent years they have tried to open up some diplomacy. The Third Emperor recognizes the strength of places like Neo Eden and the Japanese colonies, and has opened his arms to cooperation with them, even helping in forming a cross-state force to help deal with the aquatic horrors. Another topic for another day, but the Empire were quite big suppliers of that, even bringing in their own Khan ships and Iron Tungari volunteers for this, to demonstrate how important to them this project is, considering the horrors are on their doorstep after all. In truth, the Empire has to display strength at all times, for fear that they will be, well, fractured from within, and may potentially show weakness without. Whether they can continue this in the years to come is unknown, but needless to say, their culture has been hurt by their need to show power and dominance and authoritarianism. Many of the more esteemed and established cultural roots have been lost, even in their namings and language. Things have been far more corporatized and sanitized, and have lost a lot of the grandeur it once had. Perhaps we will start to see a decline, but I suspect that any sign of decline will be answered with vicious, violent retribution on the people causing the decline, or simply against the populace for daring to think they're declining. The Third Emperor is a brutal man, from what I understand. Let us hope he finds another way, as the world's bad enough as it is, without a tyrant. But that'll be my overview of the Empire of Drvania. I do hope that has piqued your interest, and we will talk more about their Wars of the Republic and the various people and figures and factions within the Empire, as there are a lot. There are many little corporations, there are many grand formations like the Iron Tungari that have their own deeply storied history. And even the auxiliaries have the whole story unto themselves, frankly. But I will prepare now for the log following this. Neo Eden. At long last, I will get to discuss my glorious home. But I'll be signing off for now, dear listener. This was another log from the Neo Eden archive. I do hope you enjoyed this one. A bit of a longer one, as it partakes to one of the larger factions. I've tried to limit how heavy I've gone into certain bits of the faction, but I've hopefully given you enough to sink your teeth into. I wanted to kind of go for initially, a empire started very strong in its culture around its more Mongolian, Russia, and Chinese roots, and that kind of absorbed other cultures into itself, and then sort of sanitized itself through very strong authoritarian brutalism and corporate sort of corporatization. That's probably the word I'm looking for. The Empire, there's a lot to talk about with them, and there'll be many more videos about the Empire. I do plan on doing some videos detailing the wars of them and the Republic, but do let me know if you do wish to hear more about that in particular, and also them and other factions, because the Empire are a very warring bunch. But, as stated by your dear archivist, Neo Eden is next, and that will be another one where I will have to restrain myself, as there's a lot to talk about there. So, if you're looking forward to hearing about the City of Angels filled with sin, then do stay tuned to the next one. But hopefully you enjoyed this, and we're very close to the end of the overview series. I'll start getting far more nitty-gritty. So, all being well, I'll have this one up for the Sunday. Though if it is late, my apologies. There's a few things going on in my life that having to take precedent, so that could affect things. But hopefully you're hearing this on the Sunday, as normal. But, my dear listener, my dear archivist, I do hope you've had a good one. Do take care of yourselves, and I look forward to seeing you all on the next one. Please like, subscribe, all the good stuff. I'll see you all next time. Goodbye for now.